This is NEGOTIATex podcast, show number 107. My name is Nolan Martin. Joining me, as always, is Aram Denesian. Aram, super excited about our guest today. You want to introduce him?
I sure will, Nolan. It is a tremendous pleasure to introduce our listeners to our former negotiation professor and a dear friend, mentor, and colleague, Jeff Weiss, a fellow co-founder of the West Point Negotiation Project and author of the HBR Guide to Negotiating. Jeff Weiss is the Chief Strategy and Transformation Officer at Mass General Brigham, where he oversees the strategy, systems transformation, strategic partnerships, and diversified businesses functions. Previously, Jeff served as the president of Lesley University, which followed Jeff's nearly 30 years in consulting, most of those years as a partner and co-founder of Vantage Partners. His work focused on helping organizations structure and manage strategic partnerships, negotiate complex agreements, implement strategy and manage change, drive innovation, and engage in effective board governance. Prior to Vantage, Jeff helped found Conflict Management Group, now part of Mercy Corps, a not-for-profit that works with government and community leaders around the world to resolve conflict and effect social change. These two organizations grew out of the Harvard Negotiation Project, of which he was a member. For over a decade, Jeff taught at the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth and the United States Military Academy. He was a co-founder and co-director of the West Point Negotiation Project and continues to lecture annually at the Army War College. Jeff was awarded West Point's APGAR Award for Excellence in Teaching, the Army's Commander's Award for Civilian Service, and the Army's Outstanding Civilian Service Medal. Jeff holds a bachelor's degree in government from Dartmouth College and a Juris Doctorate from Harvard Law School. Jeff, it is a sincere honor to welcome you to the Negotiate podcast.
Aram and Nolan, it's an incredible privilege to be here tonight, to be with both of you. Nolan, who was a student so long ago and is now an expert practitioner in his own right, and Aram, who is a dear friend and co-founder of the Negotiation Project with me and many other wonderful people. And it is so wonderful to see what you all have done and thrilled to be with you.
Thanks, Jeff. And obviously this project that we're involved in with this podcast is a testimony to just your impact on both. So thanks for that. You know, we often start these conversations by trying to understand one's journey in the field of negotiation. What drew you into this line of work?
Well, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and those were clearly turbulent times, both within our country and around the world. And I guess as a young person, I saw two very different sides of managing differences, two very different sides of managing conflict. One is the incredible toll it takes when it's poorly done, and one is the truly incredible things that can happen when people listen and sit side by side and get creative and care to leverage the differences that they have. So that got me intrigued. I'm not sure I knew that explicitly at the time, but I knew it implicitly at the time. And then I found myself, strangely enough, as a child watching a show called Dear Arabs, Dear Israelis, which really impacted me, only to find myself in a classroom, and this is dead honest, with a person named Roger Fisher, who later became my partner and was my mentor, was my professor, was my friend, who I knew that I was taking his class, but as it turned out, had been the person who had created Dear Arabs and Israelis, really to help people understand different perspectives on key issues at the time. And Roger was someone who I think really scratched a significant itch, having spent his life helping people manage differences around the world in really complex situations. And that drew me in and built a career from there with incredible gratitude to Roger and a whole bunch of people at the Negotiation Project at Harvard that I got to start out with.
I'd love to keep digging in here because I know Roger Fisher's had such an impact on many people, especially in the field of negotiations. For those of you who don't know, he wrote the very famous book of Getting to Yes. Do you have a favorite Roger story that exemplifies his mindset or approach to negotiations?
Well, I think what's interesting, Nolan, is Roger taught so much through stories. And so I'm going to share a Roger story, which was the first story I think I ever heard from Roger. And I must say I probably think of it at least once a week, if not once a day. And then I want to share just a personal story, which isn't so much of a story, more of my story with Roger. So the first story I remember Roger ever sharing, at least with us in the classroom, and I heard many times over and probably borrowed it a few times myself, attributed to Roger. Roger was in World War II. He had left Harvard, having graduated, and went off into the Army, and he was in air reconnaissance. And just as a complete aside, as I think you know, partly what got Roger into the field that he ended up being in was having come back from the war and having lost so many of his roommates and just having said to himself, there's got to be a better way of dealing with difference, with conflict. But in the midst of this, we get a wonderful story, which I think of frequently, which is Roger was part of a sort of four-person team that would fly B-17s. Roger did maps. There was a co-pilot, there was a pilot, and there was a young buck private engineer in the back, usually. They usually went up to fly when the weather was really bad, and they'd go up and they'd check the weather out and they'd say whether others should fly or not fly. But this happened to be a beautiful day. They were checking out a new constructed engine, and they're flying along in the middle of the mission. And the pilot, who you can imagine being someone who goes up there in incredible weather, isn't very excited. So he decides that he's going to create a little excitement. And as the two of you probably know, maybe better than anyone, a B-17 had, I'm not sure there are too many B-17s flying around these days, 4 engines. So he shuts off one of the engines, and he gets a pretty good reaction from the people in the plane. But he doesn't get a good enough reaction. So he feathers 2 more engines. So he's now got 3 engines off and 1 engine going. And he gets a really pretty good reaction then, because the plane starts to, move in a way that you probably don't want a plane to move, but not good enough for this guy. He feathers the 4th engine. Now he gets a tremendously good reaction. Everyone is grabbing onto their seat, looking for their chutes, when the pilot starts to laugh, and he, of course, goes to turn on the engines. He pushes a button, he pushes 2 buttons, he pushes, by Roger's telling, 10 or 12 buttons, nothing happens. At which point he and everyone else in the plane realize that you need a source of power to turn on an engine, which causes a bit of a problem. At which point in time, as he realizes this and starts to go for his chute, the co-pilot, strangely and interestingly, as opposed to grabbing his chute, bursts out laughing, looks at the pilot and says, "Boy, oh boy, have you got a problem." Now, that's kind of interesting. We'll go back to why I think that story makes any difference if it's not already clear to our listeners. But it is embedded with a whole bunch of assumptions that people have in negotiation. When things go awry, it's the other party's problem. It's their constituents' problem. It's their boss's problem. But it really isn't. If we're trying to sell something, or we're trying to supply something, or we're trying to buy something, or we're trying to solve a problem, it is a joint problem. Luckily, people know the end of the story, Roger clearly lived. The young buck private did not think it was the pilot's problem or the co-pilot's problem, but all of their problem, and remembered that they had a built-in putt-putt generator in the back and cranked it up and saved the day. So I probably heard that story 100 times. I probably have shared that story 100 times. And I share it, both because of a slight amount of amusement, and both because it always helps me remember Roger, who is such a wonderful person, but mainly because it is so critical to what Roger taught us at the outset of any course that he taught, and many courses I've taught since then, which is you really need to start, as you think about this complex task of negotiating, by being aware of your assumptions. Is my assumption about other people's intent? Is my assumption about the problem that exists? What are my assumptions about time? What are my assumptions about ground rules? What are my assumptions about whose problem it is if this falls apart? And being aware of those assumptions and questioning those assumptions becomes sort of the first critical lesson in negotiation. So Nolan, that's the story. The other thing I would just share is, I will never forget the mornings where before class, I would go up to Roger's office. I was his assistant TA for a while. And I would sit down in a chair, and Roger would spin around in his chair, and his desk was cluttered with many, many papers and some amazing photographs of world leaders that he had worked with. He'd be reading the New York Times, and he'd often have a tear in his eye. And he'd point to a story in the paper. As he spun around, he said, "We're going to go work on this." And he'd point to somewhere in the world, some complex conflict. And lo and behold, within the next few weeks, usually because Roger had one of these as a student, a premier, a prime minister, a president, or whatever, we'd be working on this. And so the other Nolan sort of piece that I extracted from that is, with courage and some good questions and some good process, a lot of what Roger taught us, you can actually do a lot of good. And you can do some amazing things. And that was pretty special as a young person in law school to think, I didn't need to have the knowledge. I didn't need to have any sort of smarts or brilliance. I just needed to have some good tools and questions with other good colleagues that might help some other people who are struggling find a new answer.
I love that, the courage part. I don't really hear that often. And it is kind of courage when you sit there and you may have to ask a difficult question, or you may have to challenge something where, it's difficult when it's just you and someone else and you're looking at someone in the eyes and have to go through something like that. And then I also share that as someone who has jumped out of a lot of planes, it is never fun to go up there when the weather is bad. So I could only imagine how he felt in that plane on those terrible nights. So
I think that pilot got court-martialed later on for some other crew antics, but we'll leave that for another podcast. Maybe the court-martialed pilot's podcast.
I've actually been asked in class, Jeff, when I've shared that story. So obviously it's going on to next generations. What happened to the pilot? You mentioned the awareness of assumptions, courage, good questions, management of the process. You are a lifetime practitioner. You're a former professor. What are the most critical skill a negotiator must learn to master?
There are half dozen to a dozen. Maybe no one wants to hear that there are a dozen, but it's complex human interaction. It's understood. So let's start with what I think is actually the most important. And it's not being a great orator. It's not being a great debater. It's not being a great crafter of solutions. Those are all great things. I think first and foremost, really fine negotiators are very, very good at spotting and managing perceptions, listening carefully, building understanding by understanding why someone else has a difference, why someone else has a different perception. Where's it coming from? How can I make use of it? I don't necessarily, as a great negotiator, I don't mean me, but as great negotiators, don't necessarily have to agree with that other perception. Often we don't, but we do need to understand it. If we don't understand it, chances are we will have a lot of difficulty getting to the substantive elements of negotiation. Secondly, which goes right with it, is being in a place where you can develop and build trust. Without trust, which isn't necessarily needed for all negotiating, because I'm sure we have listeners that are thinking, well, I have a one-shot transaction or a two-shot transaction. How much time do I have to build trust? We can get back to that. But for those who are in a corporate setting, in a military setting, in an industrial setting, in a healthcare setting, in a community setting, often we're negotiating with the same parties again and again or for long periods of time. So building trust is critically important. Then we get into the substance. I think very good negotiators understand how to dig underneath stated demands, what we often call positions, and probe. And be consistent, continue to probe. So when someone says, I want it on Tuesday, I hear that as a position. And if I can say I can only get it done on Thursday, I get a position. We don't have much to negotiate. Maybe we're going to split difference on Wednesday. They're not going to be too happy. I'm not going to be too happy. Really good negotiator is going to get underneath that, right? And we don't have to make it Tuesday. We can make it a policy. We can make it legislation. We can make it a budget. And the good negotiator starts to ask the why question and the what's the purpose of question. And is that being driven by these things question? What am I missing question? That helps someone to understand really what's driving the other party. Because at the end of the day, that's what's important to satisfy our underlying objectives, their underlying objectives, if we're going to get to agreement. Not our opening stated demands. Maybe we're going to satisfy it even better. I think fourth, really good negotiators are creative, and they're good at getting the other party to be creative. So we've got these various interests on the table, and a good negotiator has the ability to engage the other party in some brainstorming. Let's leave deciding, critiquing, assessing off the table for a bit. You need to try to get this, and this done. I need to try to get this, that, and the other done. What are some different possible ways we can get this accomplished? And really separating that inventing process from deciding. Good negotiators are very good at being able to bring good standards to the table because they know that the other party and they themselves are going to have to defend themselves to constituents and critics. And you're not going to be able to defend yourself to constituents and critics very long if you say, Nolan's a great guy, and for the sake of the relationship, he broke down in tears. I wanted to do him a favor. Or Aaron's not such a great guy. He ranted and raved. He banged the table. He made threats. So I gave in. Right. Well, I don't believe that about either one of you. It's important to be able to bring objective standards, ways to assess those options together. Look, there are myriad other things. I guess I would say the one other thing which may be equally important to being able to do these kind of things, managing perceptions, building relationships, probing for interests, getting creative, bringing good standards to the table, is the ability to change the game. And maybe we can talk more about that as we go. But I think very good negotiators are aware that there is not, as Roger used to say, negotiation's not a path through the woods. It's knowing the terrain. It's being able to spot what the other party's doing. Are they making a threat? Are they anchoring in? Are they trying to hold the relationship hostage? And not reacting in kind, which maybe we can also talk about a little bit later, but really being able to have some various moves in their head for how to get the other party into a more constructive mode. And there are lots and lots of them that can be done systematically. So lots of other things that are important. I think those are the half dozen that are probably most critical as I watch really good negotiators negotiate.
That leads me to what happens when there's an imbalance of power or a perceived imbalance of power. So I've consulted with Fortune 500 companies where the supply chain would be like, oh, they have all the power because they're a single source supplier. And then I've consulted with the supplier that's, oh, they're the largest company, so they have all the power. How do you coach people to utilize the skills that you just shared in these kinds of situations?
I think actually the best negotiators are those who are best prepared. And I think they're prepared on the kind of things we just talked about. They're not just prepared with, I have a position, I have something I'm going to offer, I have something I'm going to demand, and I have my walk away. Those are, easy things to come up with. They're not nearly as helpful as a whole variety of other things like understanding one's interest, imagining what the other party's interests are, having possible etc. So first, if there is an imbalance in power, which is sometimes just a perceived imbalance of power, but it doesn't matter, perception becomes reality, it is incumbent upon the party going in to negotiate to get really well prepared. I want to have good questions. I want to really think through by doing my research and talking to colleagues of my counterpart and talking to others who've negotiated with them that may be within my own organization. What do I think their underlying objectives are? So that maybe when they make a demand or they make a threat, I can bring it back to those underlying objectives. It's just an example of one of the things to prepare. And second thing I think that becomes critically important is to negotiate with discipline. So not to get knocked off one's game. When one feels like the other party has more power, it is easy to get reactive. That is exactly the time not to get reactive. I want to be purposive. We can talk about that in a little bit too if we want. Know my purpose. And I want to stick with the kind of things we were talking about. So, I mean, when I heard the question originally, Nolan, my pithy answer was triple down on the above, probe all the more, get all the more creative, bring good standards to the table, etc. And the last thing, just to be realistic about the whole thing, is sometimes there is an imbalance of power. It doesn't change the way I negotiate, but it may change the way I use think of negotiation as sort of having a small periodic table from chemistry of 7 elements. And I talked about some in our last answer. There's another one that's pretty important, which is my walk away. And in getting to yes years ago with the term Bill Urey and Roger Fisher and my dear friend and longtime partner Bruce Patton coined was BATNA, your best alternative. I'll say it in the way that I think it should be said, to this negotiation, not to negotiating, because it might be another negotiation. So if you feel like there is an imbalance of power, I want to be well prepared. I want to be disciplined. I want to triple down on what I just said before. And I absolutely want to try to make my walk away as strong as possible. And I'd say as well, I want to have good ways of testing really how good their BATNA is. Because sometimes the imbalance of power is because they perceive their BATNA, they perceive their best walk away as a lot better than it is. And even the simple question of, well, if we really couldn't do this, how would you explain this to, can be an unlocking move.
You're talking about power. I don't know how you've done it, but you've worked in some of the most hierarchical industries out there, military, higher education, healthcare. I'm sure we could talk some others too. But what do you see as the most pressing challenges facing negotiators in these and other industries in 2025?
So I think, Aram and Nolan, it is what we see in these industries, we see every day. We see them in the paper. We see it on TV, and we see leaders, in my mind, mistakenly model what they think of as leadership, but really is just creating polarization. It's I'm right and you're wrong. It's my view is moral and smart, and yours is immoral and lacks intelligence. It's I speak, you be quiet. It's you better listen and understand my views, but I can dismiss your views. It's I anchor in and scream louder. I mean, just if the words seem hyperbolic, pick up the paper, turn on the news, look at what our legislators do. Look at what frequently happens within, well, let's go back, into supplier situations. How many times do those turn into fighting matches? It's your fault. It's your fault. I got to tell you, I did a lot of supplier work in my consulting career, and I have a lot of friends who are heads of procurement for very big companies who often told me in quiet moments, when I thought it really was their fault, maybe actually we contributed to it. Maybe we never called them on the problem in the first place. Maybe we didn't give them the right specs. Maybe we didn't jump on a solution that we could have. So I think what I see in hierarchical organizations and non-hierarchical organizations is this sense that I need to surround myself by like-minded people and dismiss those who are not like me, right? Who do I friend? Well, I don't know. I've never used Facebook. I'll say that publicly. But I understand there's a thing called Facebook that's pretty popular, and there's a thing called friending. I think we probably friend people who are of like minds much of the time. And I think that happens as people try to manage difference these days. I think it's just getting worse and worse and worse. And it creates a self-sealing loop. So as soon as I say, look, I'm going to dismiss your view, then you're going to certainly dismiss my view. And then I'm going to say, I knew you didn't care about my view, so I'm really going to dismiss your view. That's what I see the largest problem. Whether it's union negotiations, whether it's regulatory negotiations, whether it's public policy negotiations, we seem to have gotten to a stasis. It's okay to, in my mind, not do our jobs. Because, our jobs, whether it's a job or a job we're elected to do, which I guess is also a job, is to solve problems. It's not to agree to stupid things, don't get me wrong. It's not to not understand a perspective or have a perspective, but it's to take an approach. It looks pretty different than what I see each and every day, particularly in organizations that are encumbered by lots of hierarchy, lots of rules, lots of regulations, lots of past expectations, but I see it all around.
What about the other side of this? So you have over 30 years of negotiation experience with top companies. what are some of the things that they can do to make negotiation a competitive advantage or corporate capability?
Yeah, so let's separate two things. And I'm going to reflect on, the incredible privilege of spending 3 decades, right in the field, and then the last decade doing some different things, but trying to use the same skills, and having the privilege of helping lead a university and now an incredible healthcare system with amazing people. I think the first piece, Nolan, going back to what we were just talking about, has nothing to do with corporate capability. I think it has to do with individuals and changing mindset and redefining roles and redefining what our responsibilities are. I think it really starts with, and therefore in an organization, I hope, one would think that one would model the behaviors you'd want to see, and one would expect it of one's people, and one would reward it. So, what do I look for in great people on my teams, whether they're working on diversified businesses, or they're working on strategy implementation, or they're building a new cancer center, or they're working with a partner? I'm looking for folks who can understand other perspectives, who can understand others' problems, who absolutely understand the objectives that we have as an organization or in a department or in a clinic, who can bring people together to sit side by side and solve problems. I'm not looking for people to vilify others. I'm not looking for people to throw up their hands and say, oh my God, look at all the challenges in healthcare. That's not what I'm looking for. We don't need that. We've got plenty of that in society. So the first piece starts with individuals. Let's go to the question, Nolan, that you asked. And by the way, I really do think that starts at the top. I think it's incumbent upon executives. It's incumbent upon people who are making law. It's incumbent upon community leaders to model that kind of behavior if we're going to get out of this, I think, really bad trap we've built for ourselves. Now, I'm not casting aspersions on any particular party. It's a dynamic. All right, let's go, Nolan, to what you asked. So first, I think there's a skill element. I think, unfortunately, I had the pleasure of spending a lot of my life doing two things. Unfortunately, there are things that people think they are really, really good at and learned when they were about, let's say, anywhere from 1 minute old to 4 years old. One is negotiating. So, of course, we learned about negotiating. We cried and we got milk, or we cried louder and then maybe we got the milk, or we cried longer and we got the milk. That's negotiating. And a lot of people still negotiate that way, even in their 40s, 50s, 60s, etc. And the other is I had the privilege of not being a tremendously good baseball player, but I was a pretty decent coach. And I coached for a long time. And everyone, of course, thinks that even though most people don't even know how to grip a ball, that they know how to play baseball. All right. So I get to do these two things where everyone thinks, well, I know how to do that. Everyone doesn't know how to do those things. Well, the reality is, and I saw the same with my high school players over time, as with negotiators, there are a lot of skills that are just missing. So I think it's incumbent upon organizations to train people. How do you get prepared for negotiating? How do you negotiate effectively? How do you coach those people? That's one piece. Second piece is it's incumbent in those organizations and leaders, as I said before, to model those skills. Now, I don't just mean doing them in negotiations that people watch or they may apprentice to. I mean, when you give instructions, you can give an instruction, hey, could you go get X? When you review, you can say, hey, Nolan, why didn't we ask for more? Those are okay questions, but they beget a sort of action. Right? That action is, I'm going to push more, I'm going to be more positional, et cetera. That's pretty different than a leader saying, do we really understand our objectives here? Do we understand their objectives? Who are their critics? Who are their constituents? What's our walk away? How do we make it better? You just left a negotiation. Where did it break down? How did it break down? By the way, what'd you learn? Do we have the right parties at the table? I'm taking questions from different, right? That's different. You send a different message. Yeah. I think as well, it's treating negotiation not as the only way to get better results is to have really good people who are, good in their feet. I think it's building it as a discipline in the organization. So, we worked for years with organizations that build great databases of creative solutions. They built great databases for their top suppliers or their top customers, what are the typical objectives behind different key terms? So that there was an ability to be creative by using the objectives rather than the key terms. We worked with organizations that had lots and lots of data on good industry standards to apply to different terms and conditions. That's just examples. Look, Aaron was doing this when we were working together, had the privilege of working together in the military, right? Trying to help leaders think about key engagements in a different way, right? And it wasn't just, hey, let's find 3 really smart people who can go talk to, the villagers, the tribal leaders. It was, we're going to all get prepared the same way. We're going to all debrief the same way. We're going to think through this through a disciplined structure that everyone knows. And I think most significantly, beyond obviously, I think the best way to instill new ways of doing things in an organization after training and modeling, which is telling good stories so people know what you're actually talking about on a behavioral level, is to set an expectation. We would not send people out to run a manufacturing line or do quality or do Six Sigma and say, hey, go do it. How you doing? Did it work well? You could do better. Couldn't you do better? That'd be crazy, right? There are books written on all these things. Negotiation's a discipline. It's not something we do by the seat of our pants. It's fun to do it by the seat of our pants, but it's a discipline. It has steps, it has tools, it has methods, it has data, it has good choices to make and bad choices to make. Really good organizations that enable their people, teach it, reinforce it, create systems and processes around it, just like they do for how you would manage your supply chain, your product development, your manufacturing, your quality, your success.
It's powerful when an entire organization is speaking the same language, and you can definitely tell when everyone's bought in versus just one team's bought in.
Yeah, that's really true, Nolan. The discipline piece is, I think, going back now, however many years it's been since I was in your course, Jeff. I think I took the course expecting all these spectacular tricks and tactics and table stuff, right? And there's some of that, I think, when you talk about spotting and changing the game, if you want to talk that, but so much of this was discipline around preparation and then even review and very intentional review and learning. And every time I teach stakeholder mapping and talk to folks about how to build a stakeholder map, I say, I spent 2 weeks in Afghanistan doing nothing but stakeholder mapping. Okay. So you want about, you're talking about your eyes being like ready to fall out of your head or something. That set us up for 12 months of negotiations. That sort of deliberate work.
Yeah, juxtaposed, Aram, and you can do this better than I, Nolan, you can as well, obviously. Juxtaposed against negotiations that occurred in Afghanistan and Iraq that were done by the seat of their pants. So I distinctly remember, being on a video conference with some folks in Afghanistan on a very cold night there, and it was a pretty cold night at West Point too, thinking through a really critical, I'll leave the facts aside, negotiation for being able to maneuver through certain territories. And hearing from very respected colleagues, one of whom actually had been taught with us at West Point, these were critical negotiations that we prepared for the maneuvers for 20 days. We prepared for the negotiations for 3 hours. And then told the story of, we had 25 people at this meeting. It's now our third meeting, and every one of the meetings has gotten nowhere. As opposed to you spending 2 weeks doing stakeholder mapping, which for our audience, being clear about who the constituents and critics are, how they relate to one another, who's involved in what way, what are their objectives, and then spent 12 months making use of it in a pretty productive way. Yeah, it's not magic. By the way, the table tricks, I thought I taught you a long time ago how to pull the whatever you call it, you put on a table. What's that called? It's not a bedspread. It's a tablecloth. How to pull the tablecloth and not have, that's a table. If folks are looking for tricks, look, there are a zillion books that have good tricks in them, and they may be helpful, they may not be. Frankly, we have a way of thinking through how to change the game that I don't think you need to read all the books. It's just a systematic way to be able to change the game. But I'd shift it. I'd shift to, if one's looking for tactical things to do, and one took nothing else away from this conversation, I'd say change the question you're asking. Right? Want something tactical? Stop asking. I'm not talking to the two of you, because I assume you stopped asking a long time ago, as I tried to do, although stop asking, what do you want? What do you want? I want everything. Or I want my position. If you ask, what do you want? You will get a position back. Right? If you change that question to, what are your objectives? What are your needs? What are your concerns? Why do you want that? Now you've got grist for a fundamentally different kind of negotiation. There are a bunch of those. Maybe we'll talk about them later on.
Yeah. And Jeff, as you're saying that, you're reminding me, and all the tools, my favorite tool that I teach is the favorite tool that you taught me, right? And that I've used was the currently perceived choice tool, which just feels like it really fits into this place of getting into the other party's shoes and understanding how they see the choice before them. And then there's work to do on how they're seeing that choice. Did I get that at all close to being correct? Do I need to go back to class with you?
Well, since you're teaching the class, I think you don't need to go back to the class. I think you got it great. Look, it's an example of a couple of things we've talked about. One, I started with when Nolan asked, what are the most important things negotiators do? They manage perceptions, right? So if I don't understand the other side's perspective when they're saying no, really hard to change there. I can keep pushing and driving and giving them good arguments. Generally, that's not going to get very far. It's certainly not going to get very far until I understand how they see the choice in front of them, why it makes sense to them to say no. That's what the CPC is about. And the CPC also changes the question as opposed to what will convince them that you're right, which is, not a bad question to ask. It's just not nearly as powerful as why do they believe it's in their interest to say no? Once I understand that, then I got some things to work with to potentially change the choice. You got it just right. And it's my favorite tool too.
I thought you were going to say stand on a chair, talk slower and louder. That's how we get them to understand where we're coming from.
If they're sitting on a chair, they're standing on the chair as well.
You mentioned the work that we did together in the military. And a little over 20 years ago, you became involved in an initiative at West Point to create a negotiations course, which eventually led to work that we did in founding the West Point Negotiation Project. Can you share how that opportunity to teach at West Point came about? And maybe just share a little bit about some of your fondest memories of the work that you did with the military.
Sure. I've had a very privileged life. I've had privileged schooling. I've had amazing parents. I have an amazing wife who I've been with for 43 years. I have amazing kids, pretty amazing grandchildren. I've had incredible opportunities. And I learned from my mentor, Roger, that when you have that kind of privilege, you owe something back. Now, that wasn't hard to know. I had learned that from my parents. I learned that from how I grew up and where I grew up. And I felt like in my career, up until about 9/11, there were some really important things we were doing. We were doing important things in companies and actually helping people see, hey, this is actually an interesting, challenging thing to do, not an icky thing to do. I got to go negotiate. But much more significantly, don't get me wrong, and I take no heroic element of any of this. I just found some of the organization to make them work. I had colleagues working literally with Mandela, with Cyril Ramaphosa on post-apartheid constitutional reform, when Cyril Ramaphosa was the head of the unions back then, as opposed to president of South Africa, working in Latin America with warring factions, other colleagues working between the Russians and the Georgians years ago, years and years of work, some good work, some other foundational work between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I mean, there was lots of great stuff going on. But I really felt after 9/11, so if I were honest with the audience, because I really wanted to go to West Point, and my parents said no to me once in my life. Well, maybe they said no to a dessert once in a while, but you're not going to West Point. You're not, no. And so what do we do with our parents? We try to teach them a lesson, even if they're wonderful. So look, so here's what happened. So 9/11 occurred. I have an itch of like, there's got to be a different way to actually have some impact, because I do feel like I'm carrying on this legacy that Roger, gave us and my parents gave us. And I had a wonderful friend. IBM was one of my biggest clients. I learned tons and tons working with IBM. I hope I added commensurate value with wonderful teams that I got to consult with, whose name was John Wattendorf. And John had run the Department of Behavioral Sciences and Leadership and had been a longtime West Point faculty member along with others like Jack Beach. And they had come to IBM in retirement. And I had worked with John for a number of years. I just thought the world of John. I still think the world of John. Talked to him all that often. And I liked how he thought, and I liked how he approached things, and I liked how he dealt with other people. And I called John and I said, John, I'd love if there were some way, even a small way, to be able to be helpful at the academy, especially in this time of sending, young people in massive harm's way. That was not the case when I was in college. My buddies who went to West Point did heroic things, but they weren't in Afghanistan and Iraq. So John said, absolutely. And we went off and we met with the Weiss dean, and he said, that sounds kind of interesting. And a year later, our collective joint head of behavioral science and leadership, Tom Colditz, who I think gave us an incredible gift, called and said, you know what? That's kind of interesting. Let's try it out. And so that's where it began. I had wonderful partners in my consulting firm who let me go spend a lot of time at West Point, and then later with the SEALs and later with the War College and a variety of other things. But what I think Tom really gave us, and I am forever grateful to him for this, of course, I'm forever grateful to you as partner in this, or me being your partner in this, is two things. He took a chance on a course that was not a book academic course. It was not studying negotiations, which is what academic departments, and I'm all for it. Look, I spent a lot of time in the academy. It was an applied course. It was like, go teach. We're a leadership department. We're teaching behavioral sciences and leadership. It's okay to go teach a course where we build skills and we learn tools. And the final exam is getting people in full battle rattle and sending them out on Constitution Island, a little bit outside of West Point, and setting up an Iraqi village and having them negotiate 5 things over the course of 3 hours and seeing if they actually learned something in the course. That's pretty cool. Thank you, Tom. The other thing that I think Tom gave us was freedom, right? So no one said, don't fund this negotiation project. No one said, don't put a conference together. Said, go do it. If you can figure it out, go do it. That's pretty special. That doesn't happen too many times in life. So, then funky things happened. You two can laugh at me when someone came down the hallway and said, hey, this thing you guys wrote a couple of years ago is now Army doctrine. And I was like, oh, that's great. What's Army doctrine? Which obviously many years later, in fact, almost all the books behind me are based on Army military strategy and doctrine. And lo and behold, something that, a group of us wrote became how the Army started to think about teaching negotiation, how we should negotiate in dangerous situations, how we should get prepared. And then we started to work with the various schoolhouses in the Army. Look, I'm not going to go through the story ad nauseum, but it was pretty special. And I think what really was magical beyond the freedom that Tom gave us and being able to work candidly, I don't mean to be sappy, with people like you and have students like Nolan, was the time, right? The time was a time of thirst. And the thirst was, I remember a young man who was probably 26, I think he was a captain, maybe he wasn't a captain yet, came back to a conference we used to have in BSNL. I think it ended like my second or third year, and it's been a long time since I've been at West Point. A senior officer introduced him as the youngest person in Iraq to ever be given a major oil field to reopen without knowing anything about oil refinery. He figured it out, right? So we have these amazingly smart men and women in harm's way doing complex things. And we were starting to get, and Aram, you know this far better, you were one of them. We were starting to get back officers saying, we need to be better at this. And then young people saying, we need to be better at this. We need to be able to negotiate to do something like that, to be able to work, to do counterinsurgency, insurgency work in a different way, et cetera. So I think those things all came together. Look, it was the biggest privilege I've had in my life so far, maybe short of, again, the amazing marriage I have and the amazing kids and grandkids I have. What's my fondest memory? You know, what's interesting is the fondest memories keep building. Like, I mean, this is a fond memory. I'm sitting looking at, and again, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be sappy. I'm sitting and looking at someone I love in you. We've worked together for a long time, starting at the Tuck School at Dartmouth, going to West Point. You then went, I guess you blamed me a few times for a few things you ended up doing in the summer in harm's way, but we did some pretty cool things together. You were the hero. I hopefully was just a good sounding board, you know, et cetera. We won't finish that. And then looking at Nolan, who's done incredible stuff, both in the Army and beyond. I mean, this is a new fond memory. I'm not playing games. Fondest memory, it probably was the third or fourth year we ran the West Point conference and looking out and just saying, oh my God, is this cool? We've got 120 folks up the time in the new library in the Hague Room at West Point with ROTC folks from across the country and folks from Canada and folks from Europe, the various military academies in the US, all together working on learning a set of skills and tools and concepts with our former students coming back and sharing lessons and a couple flag officer friends coming back and sharing lessons and knowing this. They were interested. They sure as heck were going to have to apply this stuff really soon. And across these various folks, who chances are some of them are going to bump into each other again, they had a common language. They had a common vocabulary, just like Nolan talked about before. Yeah. That's a pretty cool memory. I think I even have a couple pictures of that.
You hit on some highlights for me too. We're going to do something unique here. I want to go to Nolan because Nolan remembers the final. He experienced that. And unlike how I started my military career without these skills, Nolan got to launch a career that led him to special operations work and deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. But he got to start the career with that background. And so, Nolan, I'm just curious with what Jeff just shared with his own experiences and memories. You think back to the final, you think about starting your career with these skills. What's your reaction?
First, thank both of you for putting me in that situation, because when I go to my first KLE, which is a key leader engagement in Afghanistan as a lieutenant, it looks familiar. Like I've been in that situation. I experienced that before I ever got there. And throughout all the education at West Point, all the training afterwards, you don't have those same simulations. And so thank you both for helping me at least be able to be in those situations and have some sort of idea of going in there with a clear understanding, because I did some preparation as to what I'm trying to get at the outcomes. Or else you'll just be sitting there all day talking about just each other's families and everything else, which is great. But eventually we do have to kind of move the needle here. So thank both of you for that. It was definitely very rewarding. And I will say that the following year, it's my face on the negotiation book from that experience. So I need a copy of that somewhere. So if you ever find it, do share it with me.
I might be able to track one of those down for you, Nolan. So
I'm going to abbreviate the story, and I'm certainly not going to embarrass the person who actually is an incredible hero. But let me, remembering now what Nolan did right out of the academy and some of the other amazing cadets. So we had a cadet from one of the first years I was teaching, we'll leave it at that, who came back to the negotiation conference some years later. And usually at the negotiation conference, if no one asked, we would ask, what's the most interesting thing in the last year or so you've done? What's the most interesting you've negotiated? We heard some crazy stuff, like I negotiated over sneakers. Well, okay, I'm not sure that was the best investment of time, but okay, if that's what you did, then maybe we should thank you for being here and you should think a little harder. But there was one cadet who told, and I'll botch the story a little bit, but I do share this story fairly frequently as a challenge to those of us who lead organizations, and maybe actually something we'll talk about in the last quarter of our podcast here. So this individual told a story about being out on patrol. And he said, I was out on patrol. My mind was elsewhere. I was thinking about, I had a key leader engagement that night. I was going to be negotiating with a tribal leader, a community leader. We were about to pull out in a couple of days, and we were trying to finish this negotiation over security. We were actually trying to build a school or get the school finished and a couple other things. And I was really thinking hard about that, and professed that he was thinking through the various tools we taught in the class, etc. So when I heard over the radio that my closest friend, who was out on patrol, had been ambushed. And in fact, he had been ambushed and he had been killed, and a number of his men had been killed and others seriously injured. He said it was a horrible, horrible day, but the day got worse. He said, I went back to the forward operating base. I went back to the base, and he said, I got pulled aside by one of the intelligence folks who said, you can't go out tonight to have this negotiation. He said, why? I need to get this done. He said, I can tell you in no uncertain terms, the person who ambushed our friend, your friend, our colleague, is the tribal leader that you are. He called for the ambush. He set the ambush up. By and large, whether he pulled the bullet trigger or not, he killed your friend. And it was stunning, but it got more stunning. And the stunning part was that the 26-year-old said, maybe he was 27, you know what? Boy, oh boy, I would love to meet this guy in a dark alley tonight, but that ain't my job. My job is to go get this thing negotiated, get the school finished, get the security procedures put in place. And he said he pulled security detail. It's very careful that night. He said at the time, he pulled out, I think, Aaron, you may remember this, he pulled out some of the tools from class. I literally went through these tools. That doesn't make much difference. Maybe it made a difference to him. It makes difference. It's nice to hear. And he said, I went out and I negotiated with this guy and with his colleagues and critics, and we got it solved and I got it done. And then he said again, I sure hope I'll meet him in a dark alley someday. Now, think about this for a second. Just think about this for a second. How many folks who are 3 times the age, right, we'll put them in their late 70s, or we'll put them at 60, my age, or we'll put them at 40. How many women and men would have the discipline, would have the purposefulness, I know my goal, would have the ability to transcend the situation and get the job done, when each and every day, and I do it myself, I watch people get reactive. You want a lesson in negotiation? Think about that story, whether I told it completely accurately or not. I think it's pretty accurate. That's someone who said, I know my goal. I know what I need to do. I'm going to go. I'm going to transcend the emotional aspect, the relational aspect, even here. I'm going to work. And he said, we worked on interests. We worked on options. We worked on standards. Got the problem solved. That's pretty amazing. That's a challenge for all of us.
Absolutely. And I think it ties kind of well into Extreme Negotiations, which I know was an article that both of you wrote along with our colleague, John Hughes. And it was an HBR article. It was back in 2010, I believe, called Extreme Negotiations. I know that it illustrated how lessons learned by military officers in Afghanistan can apply to business leaders. Why is stepping back, getting the big picture, considering your choices, and then negotiating purposefully so critical in these situations?
I think knowing those 4 things go together, or to negotiate with purpose, purposively, unless you can take a step back and you can question assumptions, you can see the big picture, you can be disciplined in how you get prepared, how you conduct, and certainly in making choices. And so let me double down on what being purposive means. It's a Roger term. I've talked more about Roger in the last hour than I have in a long time. It's kind of nice. And it is actually, strangely enough, of all the things I learned from Roger and my other partners and colleagues and other amazing people and clients, it is the thing that I think is the most important lesson. I try to apply it every day just as a leader, right? I'm going into a meeting. What is the purpose? Someone's going to throw me off track. I'm going to throw myself off track. I do it plenty, but I got to remember the purpose. It's the story that we just talked about. What do I mean by that? I think one of the most dangerous things, Nolan, to do in negotiations is to get reactive, is to react in kind, to forget your purpose. It's easy to do. We all do it at times, but it causes us to lose sight of our goal, right? Our purpose for negotiating. Suddenly our measure of success becomes, we got them back. We bested them. We caused them pain. We're happy for a few minutes. And then we say, oh my God, we have no budget. We have no law. We have bad legislation. We have a really bad policy for how we're going to do fill in the blank. Worse yet, when we react, they react, and then we react, and then they react, and then we get nowhere. And it's not hard. We don't have to go farther than picking up a magazine to see negotiations like that. Never mind what we see each and every day in day-to-day life. Being purposive is doing what that story was all about, right? It's really knowing I have a problem to solve. I have a set of objectives that I need to solve, maybe not the way that I originally thought it was best to solve it, maybe not the way they originally thought it was best to solve it. maybe even better than those two ways. Reminds me of the Red Bull story, Aaron, but we'll after that tonight. Students who learned that after you did this, you could actually get a better solution than where you started or they started. And being purposive is knowing that my measure of success is how well I met those interests, how well I can defend my decision, how creative and value creating is the solution itself. To avoid that, it goes back to the article, right? To exactly what you asked, Noah. It takes a need to step back, right? They did something. They made a threat. Oh my God, I can't believe they made a threat. We make threats all the time. I jump out of the negotiation, literally do it. That would be hard. I have a lot of back problems. I'd have even more back problems. You might be able to do it. In my head, I jump out. I become a fly on the wall. I look down on the negotiation. I'm down there. The other party's down there. Whoa, hold on. You can get reactive, or you can say, got it. They just made a threat. Great. I could make a counter threat. That's a choice. I'll give you 4 other things I could do. I could say, if you did that, what would it achieve? That's a pretty purposive move. What am I going to learn when I ask it 3 times? Not once, but 3 times. I'm going to learn about interests. I could say, yeah, you could do that, but we're here for another 15 minutes or another 15 hours. Let's put that up on the wall as a possibility. Let's come up with 6 possibilities and see if we can do better than that. That's a move to what I think of as options, right? Starting to get creative. I could say, you could make that threat. How would you explain it? How would I explain it if you went and did that? That's a move to legitimacy, to standards. So I got a lot of moves I can make. I got a lot more I can make just in terms of how I think each of the 3 of us have some frameworks in our head for making those moves. I'm just illustrating a few. The purposive negotiator says, step back, come a fly on the wall, don't react in kind, understand what they're doing, look at your choices, make a good choice, do it again, be persistent, do it again, be persistent, do it again, be persistent. In case I'm not being persistent enough, right? If it doesn't work, I got a lot of other moves. Someone on this call once multiplied the various 7 elements that we talked about by all their permutations and combinations. You don't talk about who that is. There are so many moves we can make. I think that becomes critical in negotiation, whether one's negotiating partnerships, whether one's negotiating supplier relationships, customer relationships, one's negotiating the most complex negotiations are across an organization. The article really was an attempt to say, what do we see really good negotiators doing in the military that business leaders could learn from, and quite candidly, vice versa as well. And it starts with the concept we've talked a lot about, which is being purposive, being disciplined in terms of making choices, right? And being really able to stop yourself from getting sucked into a vicious cycle of reactiveness.
So just so everyone knows, the number is a little over 725,000. Okay. And I'm not trying to nerd out with anyone, but I did get that math checked by one of my classmates who was teaching in the math department at West Point when we were working together, Jeff. So I feel pretty confident about my number. Okay.
Never questioned your math.
I just enjoy the topic so much. And I thank you for that.
Me too.
You know, when I was first learning from you, probably at halfway through the first lesson, I'm like, oh, what he wants me to do is get more skillful in my compromise. And maybe I just need to concede more generously. That's my problem. I've been coming in too tough. I just need to be a softer negotiator. Obviously, through my time with you, I've learned that's not the message here. And you've written a lot of different things. And one of my favorite pieces is a piece that you wrote that was called Washington Doesn't Need Compromise. It Needs Creativity. As someone who loves our country and pains me to see decisions that get made, the polarization you were talking about before, social issues that just make us more divisive, how quickly we are to vilify people who think differently. Just for a moment, Jeff, whether it's to leaders in DC or it's just to our listeners, what sort of objective, nonpartisan advice around negotiation would you offer as we see a new transition occurring in government leadership?
To me, Aram and Nolan, it goes back to what we were talking about before, which is the polarization that's been created. And look, this is not a political statement. In fact, it is apolitical. It has nothing to do with one side or the other side or another side or another side. It has nothing to do with issue A or issue B. But it has to do with the pain that gets created when nothing happens or people split the difference. So let's go to the compromise piece, and then let's talk about a little bit of advice. As hard as it may be to say it, as hard as it may be to think that it's actually possible, I don't know what other choice we have. And if I were just doing it in net form before I go to the compromise piece, I'd say we don't send people to Washington to become gladiators. So redefine the role. The role is not to be a gladiator. The absolute role is to represent one's district and represent views and represent perspectives. But if we learned anything, whether you like LBJ or you don't like LBJ, whether you like that era or you don't like that era, people work together. Part of it was LBJ would lock people in rooms and make them work together, right? People built relationships. They stayed in Washington. And unlike today, where people run back to the district, which I understand, going to get reelected, they'd stayed in Washington. They had relationships. I worked for a fellow named Jim Howard years and years ago. I was privileged when I was in Andover to be a Washington intern. And Jim was a congressman from New Jersey, Public Works and Transportation. He was the best friend of the speaker, which was a little bit odd because I could never figure out how they were best friends. They were both Democrats. But then I watched who they hung out with. Like Jack Kemp was across the hall. People talked to one another. They solved problems. All right. So let's go back to this compromise piece. Well, I think we're all laughing because Nolan and Aaron and I know that I banned the word compromise. The only place I actually have complete freedom in terms of teaching was at West Point, just for this is true. And one thing I did was ban a word. And I banned the word compromise. Now, I hope no one gets this wrong. If one's thinking of compromise is be open and listen and get creative, and of course one needs to be, you should be open. Right. There's a little more persuasive in negotiation than being open to persuasion, right? I'm talking about satisficing. I'm talking about splitting the difference. What do we see each and every day, quadruply so in Washington? We see polarization. We see gladiators. We see people fighting it out. We see people arguing. We see people vilifying. And then occasionally we see people making sloppy decisions. So we got to get this done. So we're going to add this into the bill and this into the bill and that into the bill. And then we're going to do this. And then we look at the whole thing. We're like, well, what happened? Now, don't get me wrong. There are some serious heroes in Washington. There are some really amazing people doing amazing things. But if I look at the overall problem, what I think I wrote about back in 2012 or something, it's really not any different, right? It's two ways of approaching things. Either we're fighting it out and fighting to the death and really not listening and saying the other side's wrong and stupid or irrational or evil or immoral, or a lot of the time it's we got to get this decided, so we'll come up with something in between which actually satisfies no one. So look, I am not Pollyannish. I've been doing this for a long time. I love our country, and I feel privileged to, as I said before, to have what I have and be able to do what I do. I don't see any other choice than for more of our leaders to step up and say, there are important things to defend. There are important views to work through. There are important problems to tackle. But I've got to do that with an open mind. I've got to do that with It is really hard for me to believe that there are not ways to solve the problem of people going into schools and shooting students. There are solutions. I think there are solutions that allow people to protect their gun rights. And there are solutions that ensure that is just not going to happen in the frequency and depth. That is one example. I think we could go through myriad examples where a little bit of creativity, a little bit of openness, a little bit of willingness to not pander to constituents so much, represent them, that's different than pandering to them, would go a long way. Again, I'm not trying to be Pollyannish. I don't see any other choice. We've got to break the deadlock of, I'm going to make sure you never can get anything done. I'm going to make sure you never can get anything done.
You know, Jeff, as you said that, and from Getting to Yes and Roger Fisher's work, we often cite be hard on the problem and soft on the people. That is a place that seems to have just flipped in spades these days. We're really hard on people. It's crappy in terms of how we try to approach the problem. Lack of discipline and lack of focus and lack of intentionality to really dig in. And you're talking about, gun rights and gun control. There's one of many, as you were saying, we're not disciplined in how we really discuss the problems.
Yeah. And, you said earlier on, and I guess I want to just double down on it. There is nothing that I have done over the course of the last 4 decades around negotiation, work with amazing people, work on real negotiations, coach people, watch people, learn from people, continue to learn from people. That is about being soft. It actually is the most disciplined, hard way to negotiate. I don't mean challenging, which is to be hard on the problem. I'm not giving up on my interests. That's different than locking into my positions. I'm not giving up on that there are creative solutions. I'm not giving up on good standards. I'm going to push hard. But I actually care about the other party too, because we need a solution. So I care about their interests as well. Being hard on the problem is great advice. That's not soft on the problem. There's nothing. I think I wrote another one of these things for US News at the time about the misunderstanding of getting to yes, of like, oh, I'm supposed to give in and I'm supposed to show the soft underbelly and I'm supposed to be reasonable. There's nothing in there that says that.
Right.
Ever watch Roger negotiate? Not how we negotiate. Not how I work with people to negotiate. It's not how one solves problems. But being respectful of people and wanting to understand and wanting to learn, even if it's a really different view, sometimes candidly, and I know this is not the most politically correct thing to say, even if it is distasteful, because what's distasteful to me may not be distasteful to them. And maybe if I can at least understand it, there's a way to solve a problem.
Awesome. Perfect final wrap up here as your clock chimes also tell us that we have reached our time. What final thought would you leave with listeners seeking to elevate their influence through purposeful negotiation.
And this has been an incredible privilege. Thank you. And thank you to those who are listening. It's that the process matters. The steps we take, how we get prepared, who we involve, the questions we ask, how we sequence negotiations. It really matters. Sequenced and structured in the right way, engaging parties in the right way, being clear about who's an inputter and who's a decision maker in effective ways, doing relationship mapping. All of those things make a big difference, and they create a very, very different outcome. I'll kind of leave with this. The process matters. Your power in negotiation comes, my power in negotiate comes not from making great arguments. That's a good thing to do. Not from standing on a chair and saying I'm right and you're wrong. It comes from good process, good discipline, good preparation, and really at its core, being able to get underneath the stated demands, the ways most of us negotiate, which is I want this, I want that, getting an underlying interest, getting creative, sitting side by side, even if it's not literally side by side, and knowing that my job is to solve a problem, satisfy my interest really well, but create something that is going to be able to be implemented, which requires actually satisfying their interest too, and constituent and critics' interests. That's what really good negotiators do. Focus on the process, be disciplined, be purposive, get well prepared, separate interests from positions.
Listeners, you've gotten the opportunity to hear from someone I've had the blessing to learn from now for over 15 years. I encourage you to go back, re-listen to this. I'm just so grateful for the times that I've been able to study under Jeff, and that still continues. So you've had that. And Jeff, I want to say to you, not only thanks for doing this, but I want to tell you a quick story. So 2 days ago, I'm teaching at Tuck in the executive education program there, and had somebody come up to me, former military member, who was exposed to the negotiation concepts from someone that you and I taught. He didn't know me. He didn't know you. Okay. But he knew the concepts because we had equipped a student, a former cadet, to go out and to do some great things. And I just think that's who you are. Bill George talks about, leaders who are either clock builders or time tellers. You are a clock builder. And thank you for that, for the lives that you've impacted, for folks listen to the program, but all the work that you've done. Thanks for taking the time to be with us this evening.
Thank you. All of us are only as good as those we surround ourselves with. Same in Mass General Brigham, same at West Point, same in everything we do. Thank you both.
That is it for us on today's podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the NEGOTIATEx podcast if you haven't already. And we'll see you in the next episode.